Turn your Bibles to 2 Corinthians chapter 10. 2 Corinthians chapter 10. We're moving into a new section of the book here, and 2 Corinthians kind of divides itself into three primary sections. You have the first 7 chapters, which are addressed to the majority that has repented after Paul's first letter. Then you have the discussion about the collection in chapters 8 and 9. In this last section, Paul addresses more his detractors, his critics, and especially those who were false teachers in the church at Corinth. And just to skip ahead just a little bit here to chapter 11, verse 13, "For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into apostles of Christ." So you had an element, a small element at Corinth that were composed of false teachers, even claiming to be apostles of Christ. And it's in this last section that Paul turns his attention to them and addresses them a little bit. Now, chapter 10 that we're getting ready to look at has 3 parts to it. Verses 1 through 6 are talking about the restraint of Paul's authority. As an apostle, Paul has authority even to punish, but he is restraining himself, and he tells us why he's restraining himself. And then in verses 7 through 11, he talks about the release of his authority. Someday I will come and I will back up my words. I'm being restrained right now for a reason, but I will back up what I say. And then in the last part of chapter 10, the reach of his authority. It reached even to the Corinthians. And so that's basically what we're looking at here in this chapter. So let's look here at the first couple of verses. "Now I, Paul, myself, am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ, who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent am bold toward you. I beg you that when I am present I may not be bold with that confidence by which I intend to be bold against some, who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh." So first couple of verses there, he makes a little bit of a plea. And he says, I am pleading with you by the meekness and gentleness of Christ. So I'm coming to you as gently as I can right now. Okay? But then he adds a little remark at the end. And this remark, he says, "Who in presence am lowly among you, but being absent and bold." This is part of their criticism of Paul. He talks big while he's over yonder, but when he comes here, he's not so big. He's not so mighty. And so Paul is alluding to that, and he even mentions that a little bit later down around verse 9. His letters, they say, when he's away off and writing us a letter, are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech is contemptible. So these are the words of his critics, the things that they said about Paul. And one of the things they said, going back to verse 1, when he's here, he's all lowly and humble. But now that he's not here and he's off somewhere else, he's being real bold with his letters, you see. That's what his critics were saying. "So I beg you," verse 2, "I beg you that when I am present I may not be bold with that confidence with which I intend to be bold. Please don't make me get rough with you," is basically what he's saying here. Now what kind of things could an apostle do?
At one point, didn't they strike somebody?
Yeah, remember Elymas the sorcerer. He tried to withstand Paul, and Paul just struck him blind right on the spot. So as an apostle, he had authority even to punish. And he's going to mention that here a little bit later in verse 6. He had authority even to punish. But he says, I'm really trying to hold myself back here. And what's he want, really? Would he rather punish, or would he rather... He'd much rather them repent so he could praise them. That's what he would rather have. And we always need to remember that as our goal as well, by the way. It's much better to gain a soul than to drive a soul away. It's much better to persuade them to follow Christ than to have to punish them, although the punishment is justified sometimes. But it is better to persuade. The whole point in all of this is to gain people for the Lord. So Paul he's begging them here. I beg you, I don't want to. When I come, and I am coming, when I come, I don't really want to have to exercise my punitive powers, my punishing authority. I don't want to have to do that. So I'm being gentle right now, hoping that you'll listen and hoping that you'll turn around here. Now, he finishes up verse 2. He said, I intend to be bold against some who think of us as if we walked according to the flesh. You're looking at us from a worldly perspective, okay? And he said, I want you to know that the battle we're engaged in is not a worldly battle. We're not playing a gossiping game and who can get the best zinger on somebody, and we're not playing a fist-fighting game here. That's not what we're playing. We're playing a totally different game, and that brings us to verses 3 through 6. For though we walk in the flesh, we do live in a fleshly body, in a fleshly world. Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh. The Christian does not fight his battles with gossip and slander and innuendo and his fists. That's walking according to the world and warring according to the flesh. He says, we may walk in the flesh, we may live in a fleshly body, but we don't fight our battles that way. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal. Okay? Let's stop for a minute and think about carnal weapons. Carnal weapons can be guns and knives, but I don't really think he's dealing with that as much as he's talking about other kinds of carnal weapons. What are some other carnal weapons we can use? Yeah, slander and gossip and things like that. And he says the weapons of our warfare aren't carnal. We're not trying to get the best zinger on somebody. We're not trying to see who can put the other down the worst. That's not what we're doing here. The weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty in God for pulling down strongholds. Our weapons are mighty, even though they're not carnal, they're not fleshly. They're mighty, they're powerful. Now the next verse describes the nature of this warfare. Casting down arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. This war is an intellectual war. That's what he's saying here. It's not a carnal war. It's intellectual. We're fighting with our brains here. We're trying to persuade people. That's the weapons that we have. When he talks about the arguments here, he's talking about what the false teachers would say. They make an argument just to bring it to our day, just to kind of illustrate it. We find the argument people make, saved by faith alone, that's an argument. We're saved by faith alone, and we have the power to cast that down. See? Now, how do we cast that down? With the truth. That's right. The truth is powerful. The truth is a powerful thing. And so that's what he's talking about casting down arguments, okay? And every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. The knowledge of God is found in the Bible. And you have all these people who exalt themselves. They think they're smarter than God and wiser than God, have a better way than God and a better plan than God. He said, we can cast all that down with the truth, okay? And so our warfare is a warfare that's intellectual, that's based in the truth. It's not a carnal warfare with slander and gossip and innuendo like my enemies are using in Corinth. That's not the kind of warfare we fight, you see. So we cast down the arguments. We cast down every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, bringing every thought. So we're dealing with people's mental capacities here, their understanding. Bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. This is the goal of all preaching, is to bring people captivity into the obedience of Christ, to persuade them to choose of their own free will to serve the Lord and to stop resisting and to stop fighting the carnal battles, but to turn around and follow the Lord. And that's why Paul says, I've restrained myself. I've been humble and meek and gentle because I do have power to punish, but I'm restraining that right now. In fact, verse 6 brings that in. Remember verse 5, bringing every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ. That's what we're trying to do. And at the same time, verse 6, being ready to punish all disobedience when your obedience is fulfilled. I'm not going to be patient forever. I'm restraining myself right now, but I'm not going to be patient forever. At some point, I'm going to lower the boom, and you're not going to like it very well. It's not going to be pleasant for you. So it's fair warning to his detractors, to his critics, to the false teachers at Corinth. I may seem like I'm a little meek and mild and calm right now, but I'm doing that hopefully that you'll listen to me and turn around, because when I get there, things might be a little different, and it won't be pleasant for you all. That's the gist of those first 6 verses. So basically, the restraint of his authority, why he was restraining himself, okay? And then verse 7 through 11, the reality of his authority. He wants to assure them that he does have full authority as an apostle to do everything that he needs to do. Verse 7, do you look at things according to the outward appearance? And of course, if we walk according to the flesh, going back up there to verse 3, People who do that, of course they look at things by the outward appearance. That's what they're concerned about. People who look at things in that way, according to appearance, or look at things according to the flesh, they're looking at things like how good of a speaker he is, and how well people like him, and how handsome he is, or how ugly he is. This is the way they look at things, and Paul says there's a different way to look at this, okay? So, do you look at things according to the outward appearance? Is that where you're putting your focus? If anyone is convinced in himself that he is Christ, you think you're the Lord's servant? Then let him again consider this in himself, that just as surely as he is Christ, even so we are Christ. Don't think for 1 second that you're the only ones who belong to the Lord, okay? We do too. So that's the idea here. Don't just get caught up in the appearance of things and how things look to you, because there is much deeper things to consider here, much deeper truths to consider. For even if I should boast somewhat more about our authority, which the Lord gave us for edification and not for your destruction, I shall not be ashamed. Now he finds this boasting repulsive. He doesn't like to have to do this, but he's wanting to make sure they understand that he does have the full authority of an apostle. And so even if I should boast a little bit about our authority, which the Lord gave us, the Lord gave them that authority, and he gave it to us for what? Edification. What's that? Building up. And that gets back to that reason for his restraint here. I'm trying to build you up. I don't want to destroy. I'd much rather build up and encourage and see people saved and more people saved rather than have to punish. So the Lord gave us this authority, but the main purpose of that is for edification. And of course that comes through teaching. By the way, let me just stop here and make an observation about discipline. We talk about discipline, and I think sometimes we get some skewed ideas about it, and we only think of discipline as the punitive phase. But discipline starts way before that. Does anybody know what discipline is in the broad definition of the term?
Practice of trying to correct people.
Yeah. Training. There you go. It's training. And you discipline your children by teaching them. Okay? And then, to Steve's point, when they reach a point where they're not going to do what you say, then you bring in the punishment. Punishment is just a small part. You're being disciplined right now. While I'm standing here in the pulpit talking to you, you're being trained. Okay, that's the idea. Every sermon is a disciplinary sermon. It's disciplining, it's training, it's teaching. It's just like you're disciplining your children. You're teaching them. Okay, and then there comes a time when there is punitive discipline. So there's instructive discipline and punitive discipline. Okay, and Paul's talking about that here in these verses. It's mainly for edification. It isn't for destruction. It isn't for punishment, although there's an aspect of that there, and it's real, and I want you to understand I'm going to exercise it at some point. So this is the idea. So we need to understand that the whole gamut, and some people say, churches never discipline. Well, if they're meeting and they're studying the Bible, they are disciplining. That's what that is. It's instructive discipline. That's exactly what that is. There is certainly a place for punitive discipline as well, but that's not all there is to discipline. That's what we need to understand. We need to have a fuller picture. Verse 9, he returns to his critics again. Lest I seem to terrify you by letters. You know, I've written a couple of letters here now, 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, and first one especially was pretty rough. I got on your case. There was a lot of problems. And I was worried about how you would receive it. And remember in those earlier chapters when he was talking to the majority who had repented, he was joyful that they had listened to him and they'd repented. But there was that small faction there that still weren't listening and were still being rebellious and still had false teachers in their midst criticizing Paul. And one of the criticisms was, well, he writes those big bold letters when he's far away. Wait till he comes here. Let's see how bold he is when he comes here. See? So this is their criticism. And he mentions specifically some of those criticisms in verse 10. For his letters, they say, who's they here?
Critics.
Yeah.
Those
are his critics. This is what they say. This ain't the truth, but this is what they say. People say all kinds of stuff about you. But his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful. Oh, sure, he writes a big mean letter when he's off 200 miles away. You know, he's big and tough when he writes a letter. but his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. So, you're bold when you write it down, but you're ugly, and you don't talk very well. And this is their carnal battle. Remember what we said, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal? This was their warfare. They were carnal. Oh, he's ugly and he doesn't talk very well. What difference does that make? Really, seriously, what difference does that make if it were true? What difference would it make? Would it change his message? Would it change the truth of his message if he was ugly? Would it change the truth of his message if he wasn't the best speaker in the whole wide world? It wouldn't change the truth of the message at all. So that's a carnal weapon. That's what they were using against him. Carnal weapons, insult and slander and innuendo. And so, well, Paul writes a big letter when he's way off there 200 miles away, but boy, when he's here, look at him. He's ugly and he's not a very good speaker. Now, tradition tells us, not Scripture, but tradition handed down through the centuries tells us that Paul was a short fella and bald-headed and had a unibrow. You know what a unibrow is. You know there's no separation there, just straight across, eyebrow straight across, and bow-legged and a big nose. So his bodily presence is weak. And he ain't the best-looking fella in the world, is the idea. Now, I don't know if that's true, but that is tradition that's been handed down over the years about Paul, and that may be the source of where this criticism came from. But what difference does it make if the preacher is short and bald-headed and got a big nose? That doesn't change the message. That's a carnal weapon when you attack someone on that basis. Well, look at him. Look how fat he is. Look how ugly he is. Look how bald-headed he is, or whatever. And those are carnal weapons. Those are carnal weapons. And he says that doesn't amount to a whole lot. Okay, so that's their criticism. In verse 11, he comes back and he lets them know that my authority is real. Let such a person who says that about me, let such a person consider this, that what we are in word by letters when we're absent, such we will also be indeed when we are present. In other words, I will back up what I say. You have been warned. You have been warned. I've been restrained. I've held back, but I'm coming, and when I get there, that same bold Paul you saw in the letter is going to be the same bold Paul that walks in the door of the church house there. Okay? I will back up what I say. You have been warned. Okay? So this is the reality of it. Don't think for a second that just because I've exercised a little restraint here that I won't back up what I say. I will. So he's getting ready here to do battle, spiritual battle. Not physical battle, but spiritual battle. And he's given them fair warning. Questions, comments up to this point?
Well, Paul had a thorn in the flesh, so how do we know that maybe his speech wasn't as, he can write really forceful, but maybe his speech wasn't that forceful.
It's possible, yeah. Writing is one thing, speaking is another, and he may not be the most flamboyant, eloquent speaker in the whole world. And as a preacher, I always try, whether the guy is a good speaker or whether the guy is a bad speaker, and you have all kinds, I always try and say, what can I get out of this lesson? That's the approach we should all take. Not how horrible is this, but what can I get out of this lesson? There's something here, there's some nugget of truth here that I can get. Well, you look for that, and you'll have plenty to do just looking for that and not worrying about all this carnal stuff about how well he speaks and how good he looks. None of that doesn't really matter anyway.
That's been with people from all time. I remember when it said about Saul that he was big, tall, and he was had a physical appearance more like what people would like as a king. But that didn't make him a good king. But that people have always have ideas in their head of here's what a leader should look like, or here's what somebody should be.
Yeah, to your point, just to put that in modern parlance, Saul was tall, dark, and handsome. That's exactly what he was. He said he stood head and shoulders above everybody else, and he was good looking. And so he was what they call tall, dark, and handsome. That's what all the people wanted. That's where they put their emphasis, remember? And God gave, okay, you want a king? I'll give you the kind of king that you want. And that didn't work out too well. Saul was a disaster. So then I'm going to bring in little David, the little red-headed guy. And he was a king after God's own heart. So God, he let them have what they wanted, and it didn't work out well. And then he gave them David, what he wanted. Okay. Verse 12 starts the third section here, the reach of Paul's authority. His authority reaches even to the Corinthians. You know, they might say, well, you may have authority in Jerusalem, but you don't have any authority here. Oh, yes, I do. Oh, yes, I do. And so verse 12, for we dare not class ourselves or compare ourselves with those who commend themselves. But they, measuring themselves by themselves and comparing themselves among themselves, are not wise. Now that was the worldly carnal standard of his detractors. They measured themselves by themselves and compared them. They pat one another on the back. Instead of waiting for God's approval, they just pat each other on the back. And Paul says, I'm not in the category with those false teachers at Corinth. I'm not like them. I don't class myself with those people. We're in two different leagues here. But they compare themselves among themselves and measure themselves by themselves. And we have to be very careful because we can do that too as members of the Church of Christ. You ever heard somebody say, what do we believe about that? And I wait a minute. What do we believe about that? That's irrelevant, isn't it? Because what we believe could be wrong. Yes, we could be wrong. The better question is, what did the Bible say? What did the Lord say? That's the better question. Not what do we believe about that, because what we believe could be wrong. So that's exactly what he's addressing here. They thought they were okay because they patted each other on the back. Well, I like you and you like me, and that makes us right then, see? We agree with each other, and so that makes us right. It doesn't make us right. You could have 150 people agree with you, that don't make you right. You can have 1,000 people agree with you, that don't make you right. Putting in a congregational term, you can have 99% of the congregation agree with you, that don't make you right. See? So he says that's the wrong standard. That's the wrong measure. We don't measure ourselves by ourselves. We measure ourselves by the Word of God. That's the correct measure. And then that brings us to verse 13. We, however, in distinction to those in verse 12, we will not boast beyond measure, but within the limits of the sphere which God appointed to us. The sphere which who gave them? God. God gave us our authority. Okay? You get your authority from one another. God gave us our authority. And the sphere of the authority which God gave to us, a sphere which especially includes you. Yeah, my authority extends even to Corinth. It certainly does. That's what he's driving at here. So look at the distinction between those in verse 12 and Paul and his companions in verse 13. There's a huge difference. Those in verse 12, they go on the approval of each other. What do we believe about this? And we are all in agreement, therefore we're right. Paul says, no, I have a different standard of measure. I measure by the sphere God gave me. And that measure of authority will reach even to you. Okay? And he expands on that a little bit further in the next verse. For we are not overextending ourselves in terms of our authority. We are not overextending ourselves as though our authority did not reach to you. For it was to you that we came with the gospel of Christ. The very fact that we're the ones that brought the gospel there shows that we have God's authority behind us. What did he do to back up his message, his preaching? Remember? What did any of the apostles do to back up their message?
They performed different miracles.
Yeah, the miracles. So the miracles showed that God was with them. So we're not extending our authority. It was to you that we came with the gospel. We came to Corinth. We preached the gospel. We did the miracles. We showed that God was with us. Okay, and our authority extends even as far as you. In fact, when we get done working with you, we're going to go even further and preach the gospel in the regions beyond you in the next verse. Not boasting in things beyond measure, that is, in other men's labors. Now that's a dig at his critics. I'll explain that in just a minute. Not boasting of things beyond measure, that is, in other men's labors, but having hope that as your faith is increased, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere to preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. Okay, so we're going to take the gospel even further than Corinth. But think about that. Not boasting of things beyond measure, that is, in other men's labors. That's what these false teachers were doing at Corinth. Paul came in there and did all the work and set that congregation up. You can read about that in Acts 18. He came to Corinth. He preached the gospel. He got the congregation started, okay? He got that all started. And then here come these false teachers moving in Paul's not there now. He's gone somewhere else. They come moving in and take over his work and turn it in another direction, see. So he said, I'm not like they are. They just, after I get the work done, they slide in there and take over like they did it all. Okay? So I'm not boasting of things beyond measure, that is in other men's labors. I was the other man. I did the work, I did the labor, and they come in here and now they're boasting as though they did it. They've taken over. Okay? So I'm not like they are. I'm clearly different. So look at the things we've learned in this chapter. They fought a different kind of war, a carnal war of slander and innuendo and insult. And he says that's not the way we fight. We fight a spiritual war, an intellectual war, using the truth to cast down arguments and imaginations. They pat one another on the back. Well, you're right, and we're all in agreement because we agree with each other instead of looking at God's word as the standard. And then the third thing, we came in there and took over Paul's work. He went in there and did all the work and started the congregation, and then he left, and then we went in and kind of took over as though it was our job, our work. And he said, I'm not like they are in any way, shape, or form. I don't fight the same way. I don't fight the same kinds of battles. I don't operate the way they operate. As an apostle, I'm constantly moving on to new territory. In fact, Corinth, you're going to help me do that. When I get you all settled out here, you're going to help me move on to regions beyond Corinth and preaching the gospel even further. So Paul isn't the least bit afraid of these people at all. You know, they are a formidable threat against him and against his influence in that congregation. But he's not the least bit afraid, and he's not the least bit afraid to confront them and to deal with them as deems appropriate. But he would much rather, and this is the thing we must never lose sight of, he would much rather persuade them than to punish them. That should always be our goal as well. Far better to persuade than to punish. Punishment must come sometimes, but persuading is better if you can do that. So, verse 15 again, not boasting of things beyond measure, that is in other men's labors. That's what the false teachers did. But having hope, Paul having hope, that as your faith is increased, as I get you all stabilized, we shall be greatly enlarged by you in our sphere. What do you mean by that? To preach the gospel in the regions beyond you. We're going to leave Corinth and go on and continue to preach the gospel in new territory. This was Paul's modus operandi. This is the way he operated. He was always moving on to new territory because you think about, especially back then, the gospel was relatively new. It had only been around 30 years or so, and Corinth being written in the 50s. Jesus died in AD 30. It was not even quite 30 years yet, and relatively new. And to get it spread into all the world, they had to continually be pushing out into new territory. And of course, Paul's not the only one. All the other apostles are doing that as well. You go in, you preach the gospel, you get a congregation established, and then you move on and you keep pressing. Now, you may still stay in touch and write them letters and things, but you keep moving on. That was the way they did things. That's how the gospel got spread so rapidly in the first century. Verse 16 again. To preach the gospel in the regions beyond you and not to boast in another man's sphere of accomplishment, like those guys do, like those false teachers do. But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. That's a quote from the Old Testament. Jeremiah, I think it is, Jeremiah 9. But he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. For not he who commends himself is approved, but whom the Lord commends. Whose approval do you really want? And that carries our minds back there to verse 13 again. They wanted one another's approval. Comparing ourselves among ourselves, classing ourselves as being on the same page with each other. But he says that's really not important. The most important thing is that you're on the Lord's side. It's not who other people commend, it's whom the Lord commends. That's what really matters. So do you want God's approval or do you want man's approval? The false teachers wanted man's approval. Paul says we want God's. Yes.
Jesus said about false teachers in Matthew 15 that if they're blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, they both shall fall in the ditch.
Yeah. And of course, you think about that, not literally blind, but spiritually blind. They don't know where they're going. They claim they can take you to heaven, but they're blind spiritually. They're not listening to God. And so you follow that blind man, and Wherever he goes, you're going to go. And a blind man don't know how to get anywhere visually because he can't see where he's going. So he's going to fall in a ditch. Well, if you just go with him, well, that's my favorite preacher, so I'll just go with him. And he falls in the ditch, you'll fall with him, see? That's the idea. And it gets back once again, and I keep running back to verse 13 in the text here. We have a danger of this among our brethren, a real danger of this among our brethren. And when we ask those questions like, what do we believe about this? Or what did my favorite preacher say? Or what do the big shot preachers say? The ones who write the magazines, what did they say? That's the wrong approach because you're looking to men and not to God. The better question, the more useful question is, what does the Bible say? What did God say? What did the Lord say? Always go back to this. And when you think about, we talk about historically, the Restoration movement. You had the degeneration of the church, the original church, into Catholicism, and then you had the Protestant Reformation. They're reforming the Catholic Church and changing things. And then you come into the 1800s in this country, and you have what's called the restoration. What does it mean to restore something? Bring it back to original. You got an old car and you want to restore it. You're bringing it back. If you're truly restoring it, you're bringing it back to its original condition, just like it was. Factory, it came out of the factory. You're restoring it to its original condition, and that's the idea with the Restoration movement. We're bringing people, because that's what the church is. We talk about restoring the church. The church is people. We're bringing people back to the original pattern. And so you don't want to lose sight. This is the original pattern right here. You bring them back to this. This is restoration. And reformation is just reforming what's there. Well, what's there is already a mess, and you can't reform it on your own. You need to restore and get it back to the original.
That's why you got so many denominations and religions right now. Everybody's got their own opinion and stuff. Instead of reading and doing what something says, well, I think we need to do this. And it goes on all the time.
Yeah.
This thinking stuff shouldn't have a bit of work, nothing to do with what the Bible says.
Right. There is a certainty. I know God said this, and then there's a certainty to it. And a lot of that requires faith on our part. Do we trust God or not? God said this. Do we trust him? And just to put it in practical terms, God said, he who believes and is baptized shall be saved. Man says, just believe and don't worry about baptism. Where's your faith? You believe God or you believe man? That's what it comes down to. Who are you going to believe? Well, that guy speaks well. He looks well. He looks good. He's a good-looking fellow, and he carries a Bible, and he smiles real big, and he's a good speaker, but he's telling you faith only. And this guy over here, he might be short and bald-headed and bow-legged and big nose and a unibrow like Paul, but he's telling you book, chapter, and verse. Now, which one are you going to believe? See, that's your point. That's really the whole point of the chapter here. You're going to believe man or you're going to believe God? Where are you going to put your faith? That's what this is all about. Questions, comments, anything else?
When he makes that point, like you was talking about, comparing themselves with their parents, they're using the wrong standard.
Right.
And we can, like I said, we can easily do that too, because we can look over at somebody over here. Well, I'm doing a lot better than him. I go to church regular, and I don't steal, and I'm not doing this. Well, you might be doing better than him in that point, but that still don't mean you're doing right. You know, you're using a standard that's not going to get you right with God.
Right. That's exactly right. Just never forget what the real standard is, the book of God. Well, we're out of time, so we'll stop right there. Lord willing, we'll start chapter 11 next week.